Captain Sarah Chun had heard every joke in the book about women pilots. She'd endured the snickers when she walked into briefing rooms, the raised eyebrows when she climbed into cockpits, and the whispered comments about diversity quotas. But nothing had prepared her for the reaction she got when Colonel Martinez announced she would be flying the F-35 Lightning II on the most critical mission of the war. The silence in the operations room was deafening. 12 seasoned pilots, all men, all with impressive records, stared at her like she'd just been handed the keys to a nuclear weapon. Major Davidson, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, was the first to speak. "Sir, with all due respect, this mission requires surgical precision. We're talking about taking out 12 heavily fortified enemy bases in a single night. Bases that have been operational for 3 years and have never been successfully attacked. Maybe we should consider someone with more experience in the Lightning." Colonel Martinez's jaw tightened. Captain Chun has logged over 800 hours in the F-35 simulator and 200 hours in actual flight time. She graduated top of her class from the Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program. Her precision scores are the highest we've seen in 5 years. "Simulator hours aren't the same as combat, sir," Davidson pressed. "And those bases aren't training targets. They're equipped with advanced surface-to-air missile systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and fighter patrols. One mistake, and we lose our most advanced aircraft and pilot." Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest. She'd worked twice as hard as every man in this room to prove herself, and still they questioned her abilities. But she kept her voice steady and professional. "Major Davidson raises valid concerns about the mission difficulty," she said, meeting each pilot's eyes. "The enemy bases are indeed heavily defended. That's exactly why this mission requires the F-35 stealth capabilities and advanced targeting systems. The aircraft was designed for exactly this type of operation." Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, the squadron's executive officer, leaned back in his chair. "Captain, no disrespect intended, but this isn't about gender. It's about risk management. Those 12 bases coordinate the enemy's entire northern offensive. If we fail to neutralize them, our ground forces will face coordinated artillery strikes and air support that could turn the tide of the war. We need our most experienced pilot for this. And that would be Captain Chun," Colonel Martinez stated firmly. "She spent the last 6 months studying these specific targets. She knows their defensive patterns, their shift changes, their blind spots better than anyone in this room. She's run over 50 simulated attacks against these exact bases with a 96% success rate." Major Davidson scoffed. "Simulations don't shoot back with real missiles, Colonel." Sarah had heard enough. She stood up and walked to the large tactical display showing the enemy base locations. 12 red dots scattered across a 200-mile stretch of mountainous terrain, each one a fortress of concrete, steel, and weapons designed to kill aircraft like hers. "Major Davidson, you're absolutely right about one thing," she said, pointing to the northernmost base. "These aren't training targets. Base Alpha here has shot down 4 of our aircraft in the past 2 months. Base Gamma has the most advanced radar system the enemy has deployed. Base Hotel sits on top of a mountain with a 360-degree view of approaching aircraft." She traced a path across the display with her finger. "But here's what the simulations taught me that real combat experience against lesser targets couldn't. These bases were designed to defend against conventional attacks. Large formations of aircraft coming in straight lines at predictable altitudes. The F-35 stealth profile isn't just about being invisible to radar. It's about being unpredictable." Captain Torres, one of the younger pilots, leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean, unpredictable?" Sarah smiled slightly. It was the first sign that someone in the room was willing to listen to her tactical analysis rather than dismiss her because of her gender or rank. "The Lightning can attack from angles and altitudes that no other aircraft in our inventory can manage while remaining undetected. These bases have overlapping defensive coverage that makes traditional approaches suicidal. But there are gaps in their coverage that only become apparent when you study their defensive positioning from above. She manipulated the display to show a three-dimensional view of the target area. Each base was positioned to defend against attacks from predictable directions. They have excellent coverage against aircraft coming from our main air bases, but their positioning creates blind spots that can only be exploited by an aircraft capable of long-range, low observable flight profiles. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. Show them the approach vectors you've developed. Sarah's fingers flew across the display controls, highlighting a complex flight path that wove between the enemy bases like a snake. The key is sequencing. If we attack these bases in random order, the surviving bases will coordinate their defenses and lock down the entire sector. But if we attack them in this specific sequence, each destroyed base actually creates larger blind spots for the remaining targets. Major Davidson studied the display with professional interest despite his skepticism. That's assuming the stealth technology works as advertised, and assuming you can navigate that flight path at night in bad weather while avoiding multiple SAM sites and fighter patrols. The weather actually works in our favor, Sarah explained. The storm system moving through the area will degrade their radar effectiveness, while our synthetic aperture radar will cut right through it. As for the navigation, I've flown this exact route 47 times in the simulator using real-time weather data and current enemy patrol schedules. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks raised an eyebrow. 47 times? That's excessive even for mission preparation. It's thorough, Colonel Martinez corrected. Captain Chin requested access to classified intelligence reports on enemy defensive upgrades, patrol schedules, and communication protocols. She's identified the optimal time window for each attack based on guard shift changes and routine maintenance schedules. Sarah brought up another display showing timeline charts. Base Alpha conducts radar maintenance every Tuesday night from 2200 to 2245 hours. Base Beta rotates their SAM crews at 0130 hours, creating a 15-minute gap in their reaction time. Base Charlie's fighter patrol refuels at 0300 hours, leaving a 30-minute window with reduced air cover. The room was quiet as the pilots absorbed this level of detailed planning. Sarah could see the shift in their expressions from skepticism to professional respect. This wasn't just about flying skills anymore. This was about intelligence gathering, tactical planning, and mission execution at the highest level. Captain Morrison, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. What about extraction? Taking out 12 bases means you'll be in enemy airspace for nearly 4 hours. That's a long time to maintain stealth profile while carrying out precision strikes. Sarah nodded. Extraction is actually the most critical phase. By the time I hit the 12th target, enemy command will have figured out what's happening even if they can't track my aircraft. They'll scramble every fighter they have and activate every SAM site in the region. She showed them the final phase of her flight plan. The extraction route takes advantage of terrain masking through the Catter Valley. The mountains will block most radar coverage, and I'll be flying below the effective engagement altitude of their long-range missiles. The route adds 40 minutes to the flight time, but it reduces the probability of successful intercept by 78%. Major Davidson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You've clearly done your homework, Captain. But homework and execution are different things. When those missiles start flying and the night sky lights up with tracer fire, all the planning in the world won't matter if you freeze up. Sarah met his eyes steadily. You're right, Major. Combat is unpredictable. But I've been preparing for unpredictable my entire career. Every time I've been told I don't belong in a cockpit. Every time I've been passed over for missions because someone thought I couldn't handle the pressure. Every time I've had to prove myself twice as hard as everyone else just to be considered equal. She gestured toward the display. This mission isn't just about destroying enemy bases. It's about proving that the F-35 platform can execute the missions it was designed for. It's about showing that precision and planning can overcome brute force. And yes, it's about proving that the best pilot for this mission happens to be someone you didn't expect. Colonel Martinez stood up, signaling the end of the discussion. Captain Chun will pilot the F-35 Lightning II on Operation Night Strike. Mission launch is scheduled for 2,100 hours tomorrow. Weather conditions are favorable, and intelligence confirms all target bases remain at current positions with no changes to defensive postures. As the other pilots filed out of the briefing room, Sarah remained behind to review the mission parameters one more time. She knew that tomorrow night would define her career one way or another. Success would prove that she belonged among the elite pilots of the Air Force. Failure would confirm every doubt that had ever been raised about her abilities. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks approached her as she studied the tactical display. "Captain, I want you to know that my concerns aren't personal. I've seen good pilots die because they were given missions beyond their experience level." Sarah looked up from the display. "I appreciate that, sir. But I think you're looking at experience the wrong way. Those pilots who died, did they die because they lacked flying skills, or because they approached their missions the same way every pilot before them had approached similar missions?" Brooks considered her question. "What's your point?" "My point is that sometimes being different isn't a disadvantage. Sometimes it's exactly what the mission requires. Those enemy bases have been successful because they've learned to defend against conventional tactics used by conventional pilots. They're not prepared for someone who thinks differently about the problem." Brooks nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, Captain. Because if you're wrong, we lose more than just an aircraft. We lose the tactical advantage that the F-35 program was supposed to provide." Sarah understood the weight of his words. The F-35 Lightning II had been the most expensive weapons program in military history. Critics had questioned whether its advanced capabilities justified its enormous cost. A high-profile mission failure would provide ammunition for those who argued the entire program was a waste of resources. After Brooks left, Sarah remained alone with the tactical displays and her thoughts. She pulled up her personnel file and stared at the photo taken on the day she'd graduated from flight school. Young, confident, determined to prove herself in a world that had made it clear she wasn't welcome. 5 years later, she was about to attempt the most challenging mission of her career. She thought about her father, a career Navy pilot who had encouraged her dreams, even when others suggested she pursue a more appropriate career. He'd taught her that being underestimated could be an advantage if you were smart enough to use it. Tomorrow night, she would find out if he was right. The mission planning continued through the night. Sarah reviewed intelligence reports, studied weather forecasts, and ran through emergency procedures. She memorized radio frequencies, backup extraction routes, and the technical specifications of every weapon system she might encounter. By dawn, she knew those 12 enemy bases better than the pilots who had built them. As the sun rose over the airbase, Sarah walked out to the hangar where her F-35 Lightning II waited. The aircraft looked sleek and deadly in the morning light, its angular surfaces designed to deflect radar waves and confuse targeting systems. She'd flown this exact aircraft dozens of times, but tonight would be different. Tonight, everything she trained for would be tested against an enemy determined to kill her. The ground crew was already performing pre-flight inspections, checking systems, and loading precision-guided munitions. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the crew chief, approached her with his usual pre-mission briefing. "Aircraft is in perfect condition, Captain. All systems green, weapons loaded and tested. She's ready to make some noise tonight." Sarah smiled at the sergeant's confidence. Rodriguez had been maintaining combat aircraft for 22 years, and his crews had never sent a pilot into combat with a mechanical failure. His professionalism and attention to detail had saved more lives than most pilots realized. "Any concerns I should know about, Chief?" "Only one," Rodriguez replied seriously. "Come back in one piece. This bird is expensive, and the paperwork for a total loss is a nightmare." Sarah laughed, appreciating his attempt to lighten the mood. "I'll do my best to avoid the paperwork, Chief." As the day progressed, Sarah continued her preparation. She reviewed the mission timeline, studied satellite imagery of the target area, and conducted final equipment checks. The pressure was building, but she felt calm and focused. This was what she'd trained for her entire career. The afternoon brought a final briefing with the mission commanders. Colonel Martinez reviewed the strategic objectives, emphasizing the importance of destroying all 12 bases in a single night. Intelligence officers provided updates on enemy positions and defensive capabilities. Weather specialists confirmed that conditions remained favorable for the mission. As evening approached, Sarah suited up in her flight gear and made her way to the aircraft. The F-35 Lightning II sat ready for combat, its weapons loaded and systems powered up. She conducted a thorough pre-flight inspection, checking every system twice before climbing into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a soft hiss, sealing her into the aircraft's high-tech environment. Displays glowed with flight data, targeting information, and system status indicators. She ran through her pre-flight checklist methodically, ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly. Lightning 1, you are cleared for taxi, came the voice of the air traffic controller. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began rolling toward the runway. As she taxied, she thought about the 12 enemy bases waiting for her in the darkness ahead. In a few hours, she would either prove that the skeptics were wrong or confirm their worst fears about giving such a critical mission to someone they considered unproven. The runway stretched ahead of her, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the F-35's powerful engine push her back in her seat. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting into the night sky with a grace that belied its deadly purpose. As the lights of the airbase fell away behind her, Sarah began the most important flight of her life. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, 12 enemy bases waited, unaware that their destruction was approaching on silent wings. The night was about to become very long for everyone involved. The F-35 Lightning II sliced through the night sky at 35,000 feet, its angular surfaces invisible to the sophisticated radar systems scanning the darkness below. Captain Sarah Chun monitored her instruments with practiced efficiency, watching as the aircraft's advanced sensors painted a detailed picture of the battlefield ahead. The first target, Base Alpha, appeared on her display as a cluster of buildings and defensive positions nestled in a mountain valley. Sarah checked her chronometer. 2,157 hours. In 3 minutes, the base's radar maintenance window would begin, giving her the opening she needed for the first attack. She had studied this moment hundreds of times in simulation, but reality felt different. The weight of the mission pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Lightning 1, this is Guardian Control, crackled the voice in her earpiece. We show you approaching the first target area. All stations report normal activity. You are cleared to commence mission. Guardian Control, Lightning 1 acknowledges. Beginning attack sequence. Sarah banked the F-35 into a shallow descent, following the precise flight path she had memorized. The aircraft's stealth coating and angular design made it nearly invisible to electronic detection, but she knew that visual sighting remained a danger. Enemy pilots were known to patrol these skies, and a sharp-eyed observer could still spot her if she made a mistake. The mountain terrain below was rugged and unforgiving. Deep valleys carved by ancient rivers created a maze of shadows and rocky outcroppings. Sarah used this terrain to her advantage, flying low enough to mask her heat signature while maintaining enough altitude to acquire her targets accurately. Base Alpha materialized on her targeting display exactly where intelligence reports had indicated. The facility sprawled across a flat area between two ridge lines, its perimeter marked by guard towers and defensive positions. Sarah could see the distinctive shape of surface-to-air missile launchers arranged in a defensive pattern around the central command buildings. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against conventional attack approaches. At exactly 2,200 hours, Base Alpha's main search radar went offline for its scheduled maintenance cycle. Sarah had 15 minutes to execute her attack and escape the area before the radar came back online. She armed her precision-guided munitions and locked onto her primary targets. The F-35's sophisticated targeting system identified the most critical structures within the base. The command center, communications facility, ammunition depot, and power plant appeared on her display with surgical precision. Sarah selected her weapons carefully, matching each target with the appropriate munition to ensure complete destruction while minimizing the risk of detection. She pressed the release button, and for precision-guided bombs, dropped away from the aircraft. The F-35 immediately began climbing and turning away from the target area, following Sarah's pre-planned escape route. She counted down the seconds until impact, monitoring her sensors for any sign that the base's defenses had detected her presence. The explosions lit up the night sky behind her like artificial suns. The ammunition depot detonated with a massive secondary blast that rattled her aircraft even at a distance of 5 miles. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as her sensors confirmed the complete destruction of all primary targets. Base Alpha was eliminated, but there was no time to celebrate. 11 more targets awaited her attention, and enemy forces throughout the region would soon realize they were under attack. Sarah turned toward Base Beta, located 43 miles to the southeast. The flight would take her through a corridor patrolled by enemy fighters, requiring careful timing to avoid detection. As she flew toward the second target, Sarah's threat warning system detected the electromagnetic signatures of multiple radar installations. Enemy bases throughout the region were conducting routine scans, unaware that their northern outpost had just been destroyed. She adjusted her flight path slightly to avoid a particularly active air defense sector, adding 3 minutes to her flight time, but reducing the risk of detection. Base Beta presented different challenges than the first target. Located on a hilltop with excellent visibility in all directions, the base relied on visual observation posts as much as electronic sensors. Sarah would need to approach from the blind side of the mountain, using terrain masking to remain hidden until the last moment. The facility's defensive layout was more sophisticated than Base Alpha. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of modern surface-to-air missiles capable of engaging stealth aircraft if properly guided. Sarah studied her sensor readings carefully, identifying the locations of radar installations and missile batteries. At 2,330 hours, Base Beta's guard shift change began. For the next 15 minutes, defensive readiness would be reduced as new personnel took over positions and conducted routine equipment checks. Sarah used this window to position herself for the attack. She approached the target from the east, flying low through a narrow valley that shielded her from the base's primary radar installations. The F-35's terrain-following radar kept her at a constant altitude above the rocky ground, automatically adjusting for obstacles and elevation changes. This low-altitude approach was dangerous, but it was the only way to remain undetected until the last moment. The target appeared on her display as she crested the final ridge. Base Beta's buildings were arranged in a more compact pattern than the previous target, with critical facilities clustered around a central courtyard. Sarah identified the command bunker, communications tower, missile storage facility, and vehicle maintenance area as her primary objectives. She armed her weapons and locked onto the targets. The F-35's advanced fire control system calculated optimal impact points for each munition, ensuring maximum destruction with minimum exposure time. Sarah held her breath and released her ordnance. 4 precision-guided weapons streaked toward their targets as Sarah pulled the F-35 into a steep climb. She needed to clear the surrounding mountains quickly before the explosions illuminated her position. The aircraft's powerful engine pushed her rapidly upward, climbing at an angle that would have been impossible for older fighter designs. The weapons found their targets with devastating accuracy. The ammunition storage facility erupted in a chain of secondary explosions that continued for several minutes. The command bunker collapsed as a bunker-busting weapon penetrated its reinforced concrete roof. Within seconds, Base Beta had been reduced to burning rubble. Sarah checked her fuel status and weapons remaining. 2 targets down, 10 to go. The mission was proceeding according to plan, but she knew the easy part was over. Enemy commanders would soon realize they were facing a coordinated attack, and their defensive posture would shift accordingly. The third target, Base Charlie, lay 67 miles to the southwest. This facility served as a regional communications hub, coordinating defensive operations for the entire sector. Its destruction would blind enemy forces and prevent them from mounting an effective response to the continuing attacks. As Sarah flew toward Base Charlie, her electronic warfare sensors detected increased radio traffic throughout the region. Enemy units were reporting the destruction of bases Alpha and Beta, and commanders were beginning to piece together the scope of the attack. She had perhaps another hour before organized resistance would make the mission significantly more dangerous. Base Charlie occupied a strategic position on a plateau, overlooking a major transportation corridor. The facility was larger than the previous targets, with multiple buildings spread across a wide area. Intelligence indicated the presence of advanced communications equipment, including satellite uplinks and high-frequency radio systems capable of coordinating operations across hundreds of miles. Sarah approached the target from the north, following a route that kept her hidden behind a series of ridgelines until the last possible moment. The base's defensive systems were more extensive than the previous targets, with multiple radar installations and several surface-to-air missile batteries positioned to cover all likely approaches. At 0045 hours, she detected the expected change in the base's fighter patrol pattern. 2 enemy aircraft departed for a routine refueling mission, leaving a temporary gap in the air cover. Sarah had 30 minutes to complete her attack before the fighters returned with full fuel loads and heightened awareness. The attack on Base Charlie required more precision than the previous targets. The communications equipment was housed in hardened bunkers designed to survive nuclear attack. Sarah would need to use her most powerful bunker-busting weapons to penetrate the reinforced concrete and destroy the sensitive electronics inside. She positioned the F-35 for a high-angle attack, approaching the target from directly above. This would allow her weapons to impact the bunker roofs at optimal angles for penetration. The maneuver was risky, exposing her to defensive fire from multiple directions, but it was the only way to ensure successful destruction of the hardened targets. Sarah armed her most powerful weapons and locked onto the communications bunkers. The F-35's targeting system calculated precise impact points and flight paths for each weapon. She took a deep breath and executed the attack. 6 weapons dropped away from the aircraft in rapid sequence. Sarah immediately pulled the F-35 into an evasive maneuver, diving toward the plateau's edge while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse any missiles that might be tracking her. The aircraft's defensive systems worked automatically to jam enemy radar and provide electronic countermeasures against surface-to-air threats. The weapons struck their targets in quick succession. Massive explosions erupted across the plateau as bunker-busting warheads penetrated the hardened structures and detonated inside. The main communications tower toppled over in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Secondary explosions indicated that fuel supplies and ammunition storage areas had also been hit. Sarah's sensors confirmed the complete destruction of Base Charlie's operational capabilities. The facility's ability to coordinate regional defensive operations had been eliminated. Enemy forces throughout the sector were now operating blind, unable to communicate effectively with higher command or coordinate their responses to the continuing attacks. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. Her threat warning system suddenly came alive with multiple alerts. Enemy fighters were converging on her position from 3 directions, vectored by surviving radar stations that had detected the explosions at Base Charlie. She had been discovered. Lightning 1, Guardian Control. We're tracking multiple enemy aircraft moving toward your position. Recommend immediate evasive action. Sarah was already moving. She pushed the F-35 into a steep dive toward the valley floor, using the terrain to break radar contact with the approaching fighters. The aircraft's speed increased rapidly as she descended, building energy for the evasive maneuvers that would follow. The enemy fighters were older models, less sophisticated than her F-35, but still deadly if they managed to achieve a firing solution. Sarah's advantage lay in her aircraft's stealth characteristics and superior sensors. As long as she could avoid visual detection, the enemy pilots would have difficulty targeting her effectively. She leveled off barely 200 feet above the valley floor, racing between rocky outcroppings at speeds that pushed the limits of safe terrain following flight. The F-35's advanced flight control system kept her on course automatically, adjusting for wind gusts and terrain variations faster than any human pilot could react. Behind her, the enemy fighters spread out in a search pattern, scanning for any sign of her presence. Sarah monitored their movements on her passive sensors, noting their flight patterns and communication frequencies. They were professional pilots, methodical in their search techniques, but they were looking for an aircraft that wasn't there. The F-35 stealth technology was working exactly as designed. Even at close range, the enemy fighters couldn't maintain a solid radar lock on her aircraft. Their search radars painted her position intermittently, but the returns were too weak and inconsistent to provide targeting data for their missiles. Sarah continued her escape through the valley system, following a route that would take her toward her next target while avoiding the areas where enemy fighters were concentrating their search efforts. She climbed gradually as the terrain allowed, building altitude for the approach to Base Delta. The fourth target was located in a different tactical environment. Base Delta served as a forward airfield for enemy fighter operations, with runways, fuel storage facilities, and aircraft maintenance hangars spread across a large area. Destroying this facility would eliminate the enemy's ability to launch air patrols over the northern sector. As Sarah approached Base Delta, she noted increased activity at the facility. Aircraft were being scrambled in response to the attacks on the previous bases. She could see the heat signatures of fighters taxiing toward the runways, preparing for takeoff. The timing was critical. She needed to attack before those aircraft became airborne and added to the growing threat against her. The base's defenses were optimized for protecting aircraft on the ground rather than defending against air attack. Most of the anti-aircraft weapons were positioned to engage low-flying aircraft approaching the runways. Sarah planned to exploit this defensive bias by attacking from high altitude with gravity-assisted weapons. At 0215 hours, she positioned the F-35 directly above the airfield at 45,000 feet. From this altitude, she could see the entire facility spread out below her like a detailed map. Runways, hangars, fuel storage tanks, and control towers were clearly visible in the infrared spectrum. Sarah selected cluster munitions designed to destroy aircraft and support equipment across a wide area. These weapons would be most effective against the soft targets on the airfield, disabling aircraft and preventing their use even if the structures housing them survived. She released her weapons and immediately began a high-speed dive toward lower altitude. The cluster munitions fell toward the airfield like deadly rain, their guidance systems steering them toward optimal impact points across the facility. Sarah didn't wait to observe the results. She had seen enough combat to know that staying in the target area was an invitation to disaster. The explosions began as she reached 20,000 feet in her descent. Dozens of small detonations rippled across the airfield as submunitions found their targets. Aircraft exploded on the taxiways, fuel storage tanks erupted in towering fireballs, and runway surfaces cratered under the impact of armor-piercing warheads. Sarah's sensors confirmed the successful destruction of Base Delta's operational capabilities. 8 targets remained, and dawn was still hours away. The real test of her skills and endurance was just beginning. Captain Sarah Chun banked the F-35 Lightning II through a series of evasive maneuvers as surface-to-air missiles streaked past her position. The destruction of Base Delta had triggered a coordinated response from enemy air defenses throughout the region. Radar installations were coming online in sectors that had been dormant, and fighter patrols were being launched from bases she hadn't even known existed. The tactical situation had changed dramatically. What had begun as a stealth mission against unsuspecting targets had evolved into a running battle across enemy-controlled airspace. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and weapon status. She had enough ordnance to complete the mission, but her fuel reserves were dropping faster than planned due to the high-speed maneuvering required to avoid enemy missiles. Lightning 1. Guardian Control. Intelligence indicates enemy forces are implementing emergency defensive protocols. Recommend you consider aborting the mission and returning to base. Sarah keyed her radio while simultaneously jamming an enemy fire control radar that was trying to lock on her aircraft. Guardian Control, Lightning 1. I'm proceeding with the mission. 8 targets remaining, all within acceptable engagement parameters. The truth was more complicated than her confident radio response suggested. The mission had become significantly more dangerous, but aborting now would leave 8 enemy bases intact and operational. These facilities would continue to threaten Allied ground forces and coordinate attacks against her own airbase. The strategic value of completing the mission outweighed the increased personal risk. Base Echo appeared on her sensors 37 miles ahead. This facility served as a supply depot for enemy operations across the northern front. Its destruction would disrupt logistics operations for weeks and force the enemy to rely on longer, more vulnerable supply routes. Intelligence indicated the presence of large ammunition storage areas and fuel depots that would create spectacular secondary explosions if properly targeted. The approach to Base Echo required flying through a corridor defended by 3 separate surface-to-air missile sites. These installations have been placed to create overlapping fields of fire, making it nearly impossible for conventional aircraft to penetrate their defenses. But the F-35's stealth characteristics and advanced electronic warfare capabilities provided options that older aircraft lacked. Sarah studied the defensive layout on her tactical display. The missile sites were positioned to engage targets approaching from predictable directions along established flight corridors. However, there was a narrow gap in their coverage that could be exploited by an aircraft capable of precise navigation and terrain-following flight. She descended to 500 feet above ground level and threaded the F-35 through a series of mountain valleys that led toward the target. This approach would keep her below the engagement envelope of the surface-to-air missiles while providing terrain masking against their search radars. The flight path was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and precise aircraft control, but it was her best option for reaching the target undetected. The valley system was narrow and winding, with rocky walls that rose steeply on both sides of her flight path. Sarah's hands moved continuously on the flight controls, making tiny adjustments to keep the F-35 centered in the safe corridor. The aircraft's terrain-following radar painted a detailed picture of the obstacles ahead, allowing her to anticipate turns and altitude changes before they became visible. At 0347 hours, Sarah emerged from the valley system with Base Echo directly ahead. The facility was larger than her previous targets, with multiple warehouse complexes, vehicle maintenance areas, and storage tanks spread across several square miles. Guard towers and defensive positions ringed the perimeter, but the facility's defenses were oriented toward preventing ground attack rather than airstrikes. Sarah identified her primary targets: the ammunition storage bunkers, fuel depot, vehicle maintenance complex, and command center. The ammunition bunkers were her highest priority, as their destruction would eliminate vast quantities of ordnance destined for enemy frontline units. The fuel depot was equally important, as its loss would severely impact enemy mobility operations. She armed a mix of high explosive and incendiary weapons designed to ignite fuel supplies and trigger secondary explosions in ammunition storage areas. The F-35's targeting system calculated optimal impact points and delivery angles for each weapon. Sarah held her breath and began the attack sequence. 8 weapons dropped away from the aircraft in rapid succession. Sarah immediately pulled into a steep climbing turn, gaining altitude while turning away from the target area. Behind her, The weapons guided themselves toward their designated impact points with electronic precision. The explosions began before Sarah had completed her escape maneuver. The first weapon struck the main ammunition bunker, triggering a chain reaction that rippled through adjacent storage areas. Massive secondary explosions lit up the night sky as thousands of artillery shells and rocket warheads detonated simultaneously. The blast was so intense that Sarah's aircraft was buffeted by the shock wave even at a distance of 3 miles. The fuel depot erupted next, sending a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air. Burning fuel spread across the facility, igniting buildings and vehicles throughout the complex. Within minutes, Base Echo was transformed into a raging inferno that could be seen from orbit. Sarah's sensors confirmed the complete destruction of all primary targets, but she had little time to appreciate her success. Her threat warning system was screaming alerts about multiple missile launches from the surface-to-air sites she had bypassed during her approach. The explosions at Base Echo had revealed her position, and enemy gunners were firing everything they had at her general location. She threw the F-35 into a series of violent, evasive maneuvers, diving toward the valley floor while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse incoming missiles. The aircraft's defensive systems worked frantically to jam enemy guidance radars and provide electronic countermeasures against the multiple threats converging on her position. 3 missiles passed close enough for Sarah to see their exhaust plumes in her peripheral vision. She pulled the aircraft through a punishing high G-turn that pressed her deep into her ejection seat, using every bit of the F-35's maneuverability to avoid the deadly projectiles. Her vision grayed at the edges as blood flow to her brain decreased under the tremendous centrifugal forces. The missiles exploded harmlessly behind her as she dove back into the protective embrace of the valley system. Sarah leveled off at treetop height and raced toward her next target, leaving the burning remains of Base Echo to illuminate the night sky behind her. 5 targets destroyed, 7 remaining. Base Foxtrot was located 42 miles to the northwest, positioned on a plateau overlooking a strategic river crossing. This facility served as a forward command post for enemy operations across the central sector. Its elimination would disrupt coordination between enemy units and create confusion at a critical moment in the overall campaign. The approach to Base Foxtrot presented new challenges. The plateau was surrounded by open terrain that offered little concealment for an approaching aircraft. Enemy forces in the area had been alerted by the destruction of the previous bases, and air patrols were actively searching for the mysterious attacker that had been systematically destroying their installations. Sarah climbed to high altitude and studied the tactical situation. Enemy fighters were conducting search patterns across the region, their radars sweeping the night sky for any sign of her presence. Surface-to-air missile sites were operating at maximum alert levels, their crews ready to engage any target that appeared on their screens. The key to successfully attacking Base Foxtrot lay in timing and deception. Sarah needed to approach the target when enemy forces were looking elsewhere, using their own search patterns to mask her movement. She monitored enemy radio communications, listening for clues about their tactical dispositions and search procedures. At 0445 hours, she detected a pattern in the enemy fighter operations. 2 aircraft were conducting a methodical search of the valley system, where she had destroyed Base Echo, while 2 others were investigating reports of an unidentified aircraft near the remains of Base Delta. This left a temporary gap in coverage over the plateau, where Base Foxtrot was located. Sarah descended rapidly toward the target area, using the brief window of opportunity to position herself for attack. The F-35 stealth characteristics would provide some protection against detection, but she needed to complete the mission quickly before enemy patrols returned to this sector. Base Foxtrot appeared on her sensors exactly where intelligence reports had indicated. The facility was more heavily defended than previous targets, with multiple radar installations and surface-to-air missile batteries arranged in a sophisticated defensive network. The command center was located in a hardened bunker designed to survive nuclear attack. Sarah selected her most powerful bunker-busting weapons and locked onto the command facility. Secondary targets included communications equipment, radar installations, and vehicle maintenance areas. The attack would need to be precisely coordinated to overwhelm the base's defenses before they could respond effectively. She armed her weapons and began the final approach. The F-35's targeting system painted laser designators on each target, providing guidance for the precision-guided munitions. Sarah held her breath and released her ordnance. 6 weapons streaked toward their targets as Sarah pulled the aircraft into another escape maneuver. The bunker-busting warheads struck the command center with tremendous force, penetrating layers of reinforced concrete before detonating deep within the facility. The explosion was muffled by the underground location, but secondary blasts indicated that ammunition and fuel supplies had been ignited. The radar installations and communications towers disappeared in a series of precise explosions. Within seconds, Base Foxtrot had been reduced from a sophisticated command facility to a collection of burning ruins. Enemy forces across the central sector had lost their primary coordination center. But Sarah's escape was interrupted by the arrival of 4 enemy fighters that had responded to the attack. These pilots were more aggressive than the previous interceptors, closing rapidly on her position while firing air-to-air missiles at maximum range. Sarah found herself in the most dangerous situation of the mission. She dove toward the plateau's edge, using the terrain to break radar contact with the pursuing fighters. The F-35's superior speed and maneuverability gave her an advantage in the chase, but the enemy pilots were skilled and determined. They spread out in a search pattern designed to trap her in the open terrain below the plateau. Sarah's electronic warfare systems detected multiple missile launches as the enemy fighters fired their weapons based on incomplete targeting data. She dispensed chaff and flares while executing violent evasive maneuvers, pulling the aircraft through turns that tested the limits of her physical endurance and the F-35's structural integrity. 2 missiles exploded close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel as fragments damaged non-critical systems. The F-35's robust design absorbed the damage without affecting flight performance, but Sarah knew she couldn't survive many more close calls like that. She led the pursuing fighters into a narrow canyon where their numerical advantage was negated by the confined space. The F-35's advanced flight control systems allowed her to navigate the twisting canyon at high speed, while the enemy pilots struggled to maintain pursuit in the dangerous terrain. One enemy fighter clipped a rock outcropping while attempting a high-speed turn, exploding in a massive fireball that illuminated the canyon walls. The remaining 3 pilots broke off their pursuit rather than risk a similar fate, allowing Sarah to escape into the maze of valleys that led toward her next target. Base Golf was located 51 miles to the southeast, positioned in a mountain valley that served as a maintenance facility for enemy armored vehicles. Intelligence indicated the presence of repair shops, spare parts warehouses, and fuel storage areas that supported mechanized operations across the entire front. Destroying this facility would cripple enemy armor operations for months. As Sarah flew toward Base Golf, she assessed the damage to her aircraft from the missile fragments. Several electronic systems were operating with reduced capability, and her fuel consumption had increased due to minor damage to the aircraft's aerodynamic surfaces. She had enough fuel and weapons to complete the mission, but her safety margins were shrinking with each engagement. The approach to Base Golf required careful navigation through a series of interconnected valleys. Enemy ground forces in the area had been alerted by the sound of her aerial battle with the fighters, and Sarah could see searchlights sweeping the sky as ground crews looked for signs of the mysterious attacker. She flew low and slow through the valleys, using terrain masking to avoid detection while conserving fuel for the remaining targets. The F-35 synthetic aperture radar provided detailed images of the terrain ahead, allowing her to plan her route through the most concealed approaches available. Base Golf materialized on her sensors as she rounded the final bend in the valley. The facility was extensive, with multiple buildings housing vehicle maintenance operations. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were visible in the repair yards, some partially disassembled for major overhauls. Sarah identified her targets: the main repair facility, parts warehouse, fuel storage tanks, and vehicle storage areas. The destruction of these facilities would eliminate hundreds of armored vehicles and prevent repairs on many more. It would be one of the most tactically significant attacks of the mission. She armed area effect weapons designed to destroy vehicles and equipment across a wide area. The F-35's targeting system calculated optimal burst points for maximum coverage of the facility. Sarah positioned the aircraft for a high-angle attack that would allow her weapons to impact the target area from directly above. The weapon's release was perfectly timed. 8 area effect warheads detonated across the facility in a coordinated pattern that left no building or vehicle unscathed. Secondary explosions erupted as fuel tanks and ammunition storage areas were hit by fragments and burning debris. Within minutes, Base Golf had been transformed into a wasteland of twisted metal and burning vehicles. The enemy's armored maintenance capability had been eliminated, ensuring that disabled vehicles throughout the region would remain out of action for the remainder of the campaign. Sarah climbed away from the target area, checking her fuel status and remaining weapons load. 2 more targets remained: Base's Hotel and India. Her fuel reserves were lower than she would have preferred, but still sufficient to complete the mission if she could avoid further aerial combat. The challenge would be reaching those targets while avoiding the increasing number of enemy patrols searching for her. The night was far from over, and the most difficult part of the mission still lay ahead. The pre-dawn darkness was beginning to show the first hints of gray on the eastern horizon as Captain Sarah Chun guided her damaged F-35 Lightning II toward the final 2 targets. 7 enemy bases lay in ruins behind her, their destruction marked by columns of smoke that rose like funeral pyres against the night sky. But the mission that had begun as a carefully planned stealth operation had evolved into a desperate race against time. Sarah's fuel gauges showed critically low levels. The damage from missile fragments had created tiny leaks in her fuel system, and the high-speed maneuvering required to evade enemy fighters had consumed far more fuel than planned. She calculated that she had enough remaining fuel to attack both targets and return to base, but only if everything went perfectly. In combat, nothing ever went perfectly. Enemy radio traffic had reached a fever pitch. Military commanders throughout the region were coordinating a massive search operation, vectoring every available aircraft toward areas where the mysterious attacker might appear. Surface-to-air missile sites that had been dormant for months were powering up their radar systems and preparing to engage any unidentified aircraft. The element of surprise was completely gone. Base Hotel appeared on Sarah's sensors 43 miles ahead. This facility served as the enemy's primary logistics hub for the eastern sector, coordinating the movement of supplies and reinforcements across hundreds of miles of frontline positions. Intelligence indicated massive warehouse complexes, transportation hubs, and communication centers that kept enemy forces supplied and coordinated. The base was located in a strategic valley that provided natural protection against ground attack while offering excellent road and rail connections to the front lines. Enemy engineers had enhanced the natural defenses with sophisticated air defense systems positioned to create overlapping fields of fire against approaching aircraft. Getting close enough to attack would require threading through a maze of deadly defensive systems. Sarah studied the tactical display showing Base Hotel's defensive layout. The facility was protected by the most advanced surface-to-air missile systems the enemy possessed, including long-range weapons capable of engaging stealth aircraft if properly guided. The missiles were supported by multiple radar installations using different frequencies and detection methods to maximize the probability of target acquisition. But Sarah had noticed something in the defensive positioning that enemy planners had overlooked. The missile sites were arranged to provide optimal coverage against aircraft approaching from the direction of major Allied air bases. They offered excellent protection against conventional attack routes, but their positioning created a blind spot that could only be exploited by an aircraft approaching from the north through a series of narrow mountain passes. The northern approach was dangerous for different reasons. The mountain passes were barely wide enough for safe navigation, and the route would take her within range of Base India's defensive systems before she could attack Base Hotel. She would essentially be flying through a gauntlet of missiles and defensive fire from two different installations. Sarah checked her chronometer. 0534 hours. Dawn was less than 2 hours away. Once the sun rose, her stealth advantages would be significantly reduced. Visual observation posts would be able to track her movements, and the electromagnetic signatures of her aircraft would be more easily detected against the daytime background noise. She needed to complete both attacks and begin her extraction before sunrise. She turned toward the mountain passes that led to Base Hotel, descending to low altitude to avoid detection by long-range search radars. The F-35's terrain-following system guided her through the treacherous landscape, automatically adjusting altitude to maintain a constant height above the rocky terrain. Flying at these altitudes required complete trust in the aircraft systems, as there was no margin for error at 300 feet above ground level. The narrow passes forced Sarah to fly in a single-file formation with the mountains themselves. Canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural corridor that offered concealment from radar, but also limited her maneuvering options if she was detected. She monitored her threat warning systems continuously, ready to climb rapidly if surface-to-air missiles were launched in her direction. As she approached Base Hotel's defensive perimeter, Sarah's electronic warfare systems detected the signatures of multiple radar installations sweeping the surrounding area. The enemy was actively searching for her, but the mountainous terrain was interfering with their search radars and creating false targets that confused their operators. Base Hotel appeared on her targeting display as she crested the final ridge before the target valley. The facility was enormous, covering several square miles with warehouse complexes, rail yards, truck terminals, and administrative buildings. Destroying this logistics hub would disrupt enemy supply operations across the entire Eastern Front. Sarah identified her primary targets: the main supply warehouses, fuel storage facilities, transportation control center, and communications complex. The warehouses contained ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts essential for maintaining enemy combat effectiveness. The transportation facilities coordinated the movement of supplies from manufacturing centers to frontline units. She armed her remaining long-range weapons and locked onto the target complexes. The F-35's targeting system calculated impact points designed to create maximum disruption across the entire facility. Sarah needed to destroy as much infrastructure as possible with her limited remaining ordnance. At 0612 hours, she began the attack sequence. 6 precision-guided weapons dropped away from the aircraft and began their flight toward the target. Sarah immediately pulled into a steep climbing turn, gaining altitude while turning toward her escape route. She needed to clear the defensive umbrella around Base Hotel before the explosions revealed her position. The weapons struck their targets with devastating accuracy. The main ammunition warehouse erupted in a series of secondary explosions that continued for several minutes. The transportation control center collapsed as a bunker-busting weapon penetrated its reinforced structure. Fuel storage tanks exploded in towering fireballs that illuminated the entire valley. But Sarah's escape was complicated by the proximity of Base India, located just 27 miles to the west. The explosions at Base Hotel had alerted defensive forces at Base India, and surface-to-air missiles were already launching toward her general location. She found herself caught between 2 hostile facilities, each trying to destroy her with overlapping fields of defensive fire. Sarah dove toward the valley floor while dispensing every electronic countermeasure in her arsenal. The F-35's defensive systems worked frantically to jam enemy guidance radars and spoof incoming missiles. She flew an unpredictable pattern of turns and altitude changes designed to defeat missile guidance systems while keeping her within the protective terrain of the Valley system. Multiple missiles exploded around her aircraft as she raced toward Base India. The final target of her mission had become a fortress under full alert, with every defensive weapon system activated and searching for her. But, paradoxically, this made Base India more vulnerable to attack. In their haste to engage her aircraft, enemy defenders had activated systems that revealed their positions and capabilities. Sarah's sensors painted a detailed picture of Base India's defenses as their radars illuminated her aircraft. She could see the locations of missile batteries, radar installations, and command centers with unprecedented clarity. The enemy's aggressive defensive posture had given her a complete targeting solution for the facility's most critical systems. Base India served as the enemy's primary command and control center for the entire northern region. The facility coordinated military operations across hundreds of miles, directed air defense operations, and maintained communication with higher command authorities. Its destruction would paralyze enemy operations throughout the sector. The base was built around a massive command bunker designed to survive nuclear attack. The bunker was surrounded by communications towers, radar installations, and defensive positions arranged in multiple concentric rings. Penetrating the facility's defenses would require precision and timing that left no room for error. Sarah armed her last two bunker-busting weapons, the most powerful ordnance remaining in her arsenal. These weapons were specifically designed to destroy hardened underground facilities, using delayed-action fuses that allowed them to penetrate deep before detonating. She would have only one opportunity to destroy the command bunker. At 0647 hours, she positioned the F-35 for a high-angle attack on the command facility. Enemy surface-to-air missiles were launching continuously now, creating a deadly umbrella of explosions and shrapnel around her aircraft. Sarah flew through the defensive fire with ice-cold precision, focusing entirely on the targeting solution while trusting her defensive systems to protect her from incoming threats. She released her final weapons and immediately pushed the F-35 into the most aggressive evasive maneuvers of the entire mission. The aircraft pulled through turns that exceeded its design specifications, trading structural stress for survival as missiles exploded around her position. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel as various systems reached their operational limits. The bunker-busting weapons struck the command facility with pinpoint accuracy. The massive explosions penetrated hundreds of feet underground before detonating in the heart of the enemy command center. Secondary blasts indicated that communications equipment, computer systems, and power supplies had been destroyed in the attack. Base India's command and control capabilities had been eliminated. Enemy forces throughout the northern region were now operating without central coordination, their communications severed, and their command structure decapitated. The strategic objectives of Operation Night Strike had been achieved. But Sarah's celebration was premature. Her threat warning system detected multiple enemy fighters converging on her position from all directions. These pilots were flying with desperation now, knowing that failure to stop her would mean the loss of their entire defensive network. They were closing rapidly, firing missiles at maximum range in hopes of achieving a lucky hit. Sarah checked her fuel gauges and felt her stomach drop. The constant maneuvering and high-speed flight had consumed more fuel than her most pessimistic calculations. She had enough fuel to reach friendly territory, but only if she could avoid further combat. Any additional aerial engagements would leave her stranded deep in enemy airspace. She turned toward home and pushed the F-35 to maximum cruise speed. The aircraft streaked across the landscape at speeds that blurred the terrain below, racing against her fuel supply and the pursuing enemy fighters. Behind her, the night sky glowed with the fires of 8 destroyed enemy bases, marking the path of destruction she had carved across the battlefield. The enemy fighters were faster than her damaged aircraft, but they lacked the F-35 stealth characteristics. Sarah disappeared from their radar screens as she increased her distance from their sensors, becoming invisible once again in the electronic spectrum. The pursuing pilots fired their missiles blind, hoping to hit a target they could no longer see. Sarah flew through the pre-dawn darkness with her fuel needles hovering near empty. Every minute of flight brought her closer to safety, but also closer to fuel exhaustion. She calculated and recalculated her fuel consumption, looking for ways to extend her range without sacrificing too much speed. The mountains gave way to foothills, and the foothills gave way to the flat terrain of the border region. Sarah could see the first hints of friendly territory on her navigation display, but her fuel situation was becoming critical. The F-35's engines were beginning to surge as the fuel pumps drew from nearly empty tanks. At 0734 hours, her radio crackled with the most welcome sound she had heard all night. Lightning 1, this is Guardian Control. We have you on radar, 15 miles from friendly territory. Emergency services are standing by for immediate refueling if required. Guardian Control, Lightning 1. Mission complete. All targets destroyed. Request immediate emergency refueling. Fuel state critical. Sarah crossed into friendly airspace with her engines running on fuel vapors. She could see the tanker aircraft waiting for her, its fuel lines extended and ready for emergency connection. The aerial refueling was completed in record time, filling her tanks with enough fuel to reach her home base. As the sun rose over the horizon, Sarah flew her battered F-35 Lightning II toward home. Behind her, 8 enemy bases lay in ruins, their destruction marking the most successful single aircraft mission in recent military history. The skeptics who had questioned her ability to handle such a critical mission would have to reconsider their assumptions about what she could achieve. The radio crackled with congratulatory messages from commanders throughout the theater of operations. Ground forces reported that enemy artillery fire had ceased across the entire front. Air defense networks had gone silent. Communications had been disrupted. The enemy's ability to coordinate large-scale operations had been shattered. Colonel Martinez's voice came through clearly as Sarah approached her home airbase. Lightning 1, outstanding work. Intelligence confirms complete destruction of all 12 targets. Enemy command and control capabilities have been eliminated across the northern sector. Sarah smiled as she lowered the landing gear and lined up with the runway. Guardian Control, Lightning 1. 12 targets confirmed destroyed. The F-35 Lightning II has proven its capabilities tonight. As she touched down on the runway, Sarah reflected on the night's mission. She had proven that precision and planning could overcome numerical superiority. She had demonstrated that advanced technology, properly employed, could achieve results that seemed impossible. Most importantly, she had shown that being underestimated could be turned into a tactical advantage. The ground crew surrounded her aircraft as she shut down the engines. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez grinned broadly as he examined the missile damage to her aircraft. Looks like you found some excitement out there, Captain. How did the Lightning perform? Sarah climbed out of the cockpit and looked back at her aircraft. Despite the damage, despite the fuel leaks, despite the warning lights and system failures, the F-35 had brought her home safely after the most challenging mission of her career. Chief, she performed exactly as advertised. Maybe better. As Sarah walked toward the debriefing room, she thought about the colleagues who had questioned whether she was ready for such a critical mission. Their concerns had been professional and well-intentioned, but they had failed to understand that sometimes the best pilot for a mission isn't the one with the most conventional experience. Sometimes it's the one who approaches the problem from a completely different angle. The mission had proven that the F-35 Lightning II could execute the deep strike operations it had been designed for. More importantly, it had proven that modern warfare required pilots who could think beyond traditional tactics and employ new technologies in ways that older generations of military aviators couldn't imagine. Major Davidson was among the officers waiting to congratulate her as she entered the debriefing room. His expression was one of professional respect, mixed with genuine surprise at the scope of her achievement. Captain Chun, I owe you an apology. I questioned whether you were ready for this mission. I was wrong. Sarah shook his hand and smiled. Major, Your concerns were valid. This was a dangerous mission that required perfect execution. But that's exactly why it required someone who approached the problem differently than conventional pilots would have. As the debriefing continued through the morning, Sarah provided detailed accounts of each target engagement, defensive response, and tactical decision. Intelligence officers took notes frantically, documenting lessons learned and tactical innovations that would be incorporated into future mission planning. The success of Operation Night Strike would change how military planners thought about single-aircraft deep strike missions. The F-35's capabilities, properly employed by a pilot who understood how to maximize their effectiveness, had achieved results that would have required dozens of aircraft using conventional tactics. But for Sarah, the most important result wasn't tactical or strategic. It was the knowledge that she had proven herself capable of handling the most challenging missions her profession could offer. The skeptics would always exist, but they would have to acknowledge that she had earned her place among the elite pilots of the Air Force. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, the smoke from 12 destroyed enemy bases continued to rise in the distance, a monument to what could be achieved when advanced technology met innovative thinking and uncompromising determination. The night Sarah Chun was handed an F-35 and told it was pointless had become the night she proved that everything was possible.